Chapter 10. There are two ways to turn the page, Finn. The easy way and the hard way. We were back to turning pages of sheet music. With Mac over my shoulder, we looked intently at the violin and piano duet we had just rehearsed. I had managed to stifle my doubts for the time being and try to actually tap into this superpower. All kids dream of using mind powers to thwart their enemies, or to go invisible and sneak into the girls' shower. Or maybe that's just me. Mac continued. Remember, the laws of physics still apply to the power. A rock is harder to move than a feather. Let me ask you a question, and yes, this is a test. What keeps a plane in the air? My scientific brain kicked in before my mouth could spit out the obvious answer. Air makes planes fly. Max smiled and nodded, so I continued. Most people would say the engine or the wings, but it is really all those things working together with the air. There's not enough thrust in the engines of a jumbo jet to do a vertical takeoff. It needs air to ride upon to climb into the sky. It's the Bernoulli effect, I think. Indeed, the Bernoulli effect. The shape of the wing moves the air in such a way that the air pushes the plane upward. In the same way, you do not need to lift a heavy thing directly. You can instead use the air to move it for you, just like the plane, understand? I think so. Not really. Now, the easy way to turn the page is to use the air to turn the page for you. Air movement is one of the easiest things to master with the power. You do not need to be able to lift a page if you can just move the air over the page. Here, try it yourself. With that, he turned and stretched out a hand in the direction of the kitchen. A cabinet popped open and something flew out across the room and into his outstretched hand. It was a simple drinking straw, which he then handed to me. And what should I do with this? Use the straw to turn the page. I smirked back at him and took the straw. Using one end in my mouth, I sucked the page with the other end and lifted it slightly, and then in a quick movement, I tried to flip it around and manually turn the page. I failed, of course, and felt like an idiot to boot. I tried several more times until I finally got it right. Good, Finn. Not what I expected, but still good. I think this was his way of saying, you're a moron. Let's look at the first part of the trick. You use suction to get the page to lift. I just nodded and waited for the next part of the explanation. The Bernoulli effect uses air imbalances on either side of a wing to achieve lift of an aircraft. In the same way, you can use air imbalances to get the page to turn. You use the straw to make a vacuum on one side, an air imbalance, and then lifted the page. Try something else. Try blowing across the surface of the page. I took the straw and laid the binder of sheet music flat on top of the piano. I bent over and blew across the surface of the sheet, and sure enough, it fluttered up. Not magic, just science. Do you understand what is happening there, Finn? Sure. Just like the plane, I'm blowing the air across the surface of one side, which makes an imbalance in air pressure, and the page moves. So now, move the air with the power. If all the air above the page were to lift away, the page will follow. That's how most of our tricks are done. Nella made a clucking sound, disapproving of the word trick. Go ahead, give it a try. Oh, what the hell. I'll try anything twice, I said as I held out my hand toward the music still lying on the back of the piano. Even with my vivid imagination seeing the air molecules bolting away from the sheet, it continued to remain motionless in front of me. I flexed my fingers and squinted my eyes and even cursed under my breath. Nothing. The weight of their stares didn't help, of course. I sighed loudly. If you'd have gotten it on your first real try, I would have slapped you, Lexi said from the kitchen. Nobody gets it on their first try. Mind if I help? Mac gave a quick nod, and Lexi came over and gently placed her hand on my shoulder. I immediately felt the benefits of Lexi's instructional tutoring. This might not help, but it will certainly make it more fun. Go ahead. Try it again, Finn. But this time, focus your energy on my hand on your shoulder, or my voice. She leaned into me and said softly in my ear, Ignore the book, like you are ignoring the piano bench you are sitting on. Just my voice, my hand, my breath. Now, almost as an afterthought, move the arrow away from the page. Nothing happened, at least not with the book. I challenge any viral man to focus on anything constructive when a beautiful redhead is whispering in your ear. My immediate concerns were somewhat more primitive. More words were coming from her lips to my ear and saying something about the page of the book. My thoughts stayed on the warm breath on my ear and her weight on my shoulder. The light even seemed to be shifting to blue, and the page in front of me flipped. She squeezed my shoulder. I knew you could do it, she said in an excited whisper still close to my ear. I turned my head, and our faces were significantly closer than most people's comfort zone allows. Kissable close. She smiled and slowly backed away. Mental note, I gotta get me a tutor like that. Only then did it dawn on me that I actually did flip the page. Mac and Juliet were smiling. Nella even looked impressed, or at least a little less dissatisfied at my existence. So, I did that? I'm not sure I did anything. Of course you did, Finn, Nella said matter-of-factly. And believe me, we are all a bit surprised. Not many ordinary people get it on their first day. Since when did you start including me with the ordinary people? I asked Nella with a smirk. Mac straightened up and asked, Finn, can you describe what was going through your mind when you flipped the page? Obviously, telling the truth was not going to happen here. Thanks, Lexi. Well, I was mostly focused on Lexi's voice, and then I imagined sucking the air away from the page, like I was sucking in with a giant straw over the whole page. Yeah, let's go with the partial truth, then. There is usually a big stumbling block when people first try to use the power, almost like their head gets in the way, Mac explained. Most people overthink the action and try too hard. Well, I avoid thinking too hard at all costs. Mac chuckled. Seriously, Finn, you don't think about how to pick up a glass of water, which muscles to use, and how much force to exert. It's just automatic. The same goes with the power. Any time you are struggling to use the power, it is usually because you are trying too hard. Faith of a child, Juliet added. Several seconds of silence encouraged her to continue. Jesus always said we needed to have the faith of a child. Ever notice how children will just automatically believe what you tell them? The Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus is all the proof you need. Or Jesus Christ, for that matter, I almost added, but didn't. She continued, believing that you have the power, believing that the page will turn, or the fish will jump, or the person gets healed. Her voice cracked a little. That's called faith. One of the magnarum virtutum trium, the three great virtues. Let me guess. Faith, hope, and love, with love being the big one, right? Yeah, I got something out of my 12 years of Catholic school. Besides guilt, I mean. She just nodded. We explained a bit before, Nella said, more to Mac than me, about how Jesus came to earth to teach us all how to use the power and ultimately join him in eternity. Mac looked over at me, trying to get a read. Admittedly, my doubts about the power were fading, but if I had to start believing in an imaginary, super-powerful, invisible deity that listened to the simultaneous prayers of billions of people and disregarded the laws of physics and nature, which he created in the first place, so he could grant wishes to his favorites, then they would need to do better. Admitting there was a power that could be tapped into was not the same as admitting there was an all-powerful God. As we discussed before, there are far more things we do not understand about the construction of the universe, so of course it is conceivable that telepathic manipulation can certainly be one of them. So the Bible is supposed to be an instruction book for using the power of creation, right? I asked. Both Nella and Mac glanced at each other, hoping that the other would answer. Mac finally gave in and responded. Well, not exactly. The Bible was written years, maybe generations after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and they were most certainly not written by the actual authors. Ever notice how they always say, the Gospel according to Matthew? I nodded, acknowledging a commonly held belief about the Gospels. Mac continued, the Gospels were passed on for years and years by word of mouth. They were actually written down by unknown persons, not the first account witnesses to the events. Interestingly enough, the written versions offer virtually no instructional value or mention of the power of creation at all. The stories of all the miracles were already popularly known throughout the region, so the Gospels focused on them instead of the real important lessons of using the power and spreading the good news. That everyone already had the power within them. They just needed to learn to use it. Somehow the message got diluted over the centuries, possibly even in the original copies. Mac paused as if carefully choosing his words. There are those that believe the devil infiltrated the church in order to corrupt from within, shape the message to the flock. His eyes settled on Nella, who was returning his stare. I suspected a bit of uncomfortable history existed between them. Excellent. Time to open the wound a little. I take it not everyone agrees that the church could have been infiltrated by the devil. Fuse lit. Fireworks in 3, 2, 1. Nella launched first. It's not hard to see that most faiths are steeped in corruption. The Christians started the Crusades. The evangelicals prey on the wealthy elderly. The Catholics abuse altar boys, and the Muslims oppress women and anyone different than themselves. If they're not too busy blowing themselves up in hopes of getting laid by a bunch of virgins in the afterlife, of course. Did I miss anyone? What about the Jews? Mac beat me to the punch. Nella shot him a glare. This was turning out to be a pretty interesting afternoon. Anyway, she continued, my point is simply that all religions have dramatic examples of fallen infiltration. Usually it is just chalked up to human failure or some natural shortcomings of the species, and people generally are content to dismiss these evils. I don't think you'll get an argument out of me, Nella. There are a crap ton of evil people wearing the cloak of religion, and they generally operate with impunity. Why do you disagree, Mac? Mac looked more than a bit disgruntled, but he was a professional and replied coolly, No disagreement on that point. I think we need to be careful and distinguish what we know and what we hypothesize, or what we've been told but not verified. Agreed? Nods all around. Okay, then. I'm happy to agree that there are evil people and fallen all around us. We have seen plenty of evidence of that. We have no evidence that the fallen have infiltrated any religion, but it seems logical that they would attempt to do just that. We have no evidence that any Bible writings are corrupt. That is a pure guess. As you can see, Finn, Nella replied with a smile, this is an old argument. Mac is right. We don't know anything for sure. In my opinion, it seems logical that at the time of the early church, the apostles and first disciples were likely very popular, bordering on famous. Imagine walking around doing the most amazing magic and then teaching everyone who would listen. They in turn would do the same. How perfect a tool for spreading the good news. There is no fear of misuse of the power because it can only be used with the great virtues anyway. The early church spread very quickly, she continued, as seen in the historical records, but the persecution of the early Christians started at the exact same time, maybe earlier with Judas, the first corrupt insider. From there, who knows where the corruption spread? Logically, if your goal is to stop something that has a great deal of momentum, like the early church, then the best way is not to push directly against it, but instead to make it veer off course. Misdirect the church away from the intended purpose with a slight nudge early on. If left uncorrected, that small nudge turns into a major detour later. The purpose of Jesus coming to earth was to become a teacher for the power of creation. And he was, at first. The teachings were passed on for the first few generations, despite the persecutions and the constant fear of death. But when it became obvious that the momentum could not be stopped, the devil decided to just give it a nudge and be patient. Remember the Colosseum in Rome, where the Christians would be rounded up and slaughtered by lions or by gladiators? That was when the fallen were trying to stop the momentum dead. When it failed, it is believed that the fallen infiltrated the church at all levels. Eventually, the scriptures were documented and written down to better control the message, to better control the direction of the faith, and to push the truth out of view. Some of the other scriptures of the time, the Gnostic Gospels, are even crazier than the main four that everyone knows about. The very plain lessons and teachings that led to the rapid growth of the early church were suddenly replaced by written teachings that began a fracturing of the church and a competition between communities. The community of Matthew fought for membership with the community of Thomas. Both had gospels associated with their communities. Both had similar ideas. But for some reason, they were no longer preaching the right message. Eventually, the message of Jesus changed to be that of an all-powerful being that needed to be worshipped, and the evidence for the existence of God was the miracles he performed. The main reason he came was to teach people to use the power, not to demand homage and authority over humanity. That, Finn, is the great corruption that brings us to where we are today, 1,000,000 miles from where we are supposed to be, all started with a little nudge. Plausible. Sure. But likely? Probably not as likely that Lexi had a hidden tattoo. That I bet I could find. Wait. What was the question? Finn, instead of us old birds bickering over the minutiae, how about you tell us what you've absorbed so far? Max said with an approving nod from Nella. As I'm sure you can tell, we don't have an approved teaching curriculum for new students. I adjusted myself on the piano bench, which becomes surprisingly uncomfortable very quickly unless you're actually playing piano. Well, let's start with the basics. That the power of creation is a real thing and it can be used by all people. All human beings have been given a free will by their creator so that they can choose to use the power or not. And it's the same free will that allows all people to love each other and spread love or hate as they choose. Spreading love will enable them to use the power. Hate, well, not so much. Nella gave a quick nod, so I knew I was getting a solid B in the class so far. But I should probably back up a bit, back to the reason all humans were created. Apparently, there is a great war between the forces of good and the forces of evil. One of God's angels, Lucifer, betrayed him, was kicked out of heaven, along with all those loyal to Lucifer. We call them the fallen, and they collectively are known as the Army of Darkness. Instead of starting a death metal rock band like they should have, the fallen were imprisoned for 1,000 years. After which the battle was to begin. Both sides continued to prepare for war, which apparently God was unsure he could win. A slight frown formed on Nella's face, but Max smirked. I continued. So he decided to build his army further by giving the power of creation to all humanity. Once they learned to use the power of creation, they could join him in eternity, where the battle with the forces of darkness would eventually unfold. How am I doing so far? At best, my grade was down to a C+ because of the sarcasm. Doing great, Max said quickly. Keep in mind that most of what we have told you is not provable, but worth considering as it likely contains elements of truth. That's a good point, Mac, I replied. How have you come to know all these things you claim to be potentially true? Why should I believe you instead of my saintly mother and the dogma beat into me as a child?" "You shouldn't believe us, Finn," Nella quickly replied. My eyebrows instinctively rose as though she obviously misspoke. "Find your own truths. It will help us all. We can certainly tell you all the reasons why we believe these things to be true, but in the end, you should not trust us at our word. We can certainly tell you all the reasons why we believe these things to be true, but in the end, you should not trust us at our word. That is exactly how the early church and all the centuries since have gone astray. People believed because they were told to believe. No one stopped to ask if they made sense or if there was a better explanation. Authority within the church became the rule, and those who would not relinquish their intellect and forego their free will were punished, ostracized, and even killed. Heretics were supposedly the most evil people alive. In reality, they may have been the ones still searching for the truth, still hungry for that taste of reality. Several seconds of silence hung in the air with her last words. The fleeting taste of reality kindled an old hunger deep inside me. "So, here we are," I continued, "stuck in this malaise, doomed to repeat unless we learn to use the power and enlist in the army of light. I'm really not sold on the reincarnation idea, though. How is it you know anything about restarting, since our memories have been wiped completely with every new beginning?" Both Nella and Mac exchanged knowing looks, as if trying to decide if I could be trusted. That was when Juliet came around the side of the piano and sat on the bench next to me. She didn't seem conflicted at all, but she had that motherly, warm presence to her, instant likability. "The streets around Philadelphia have more than just fallen soldiers walking around. Real angels are here, too. We have come to know a few. At least, that is who we think they are. It is very difficult to say for sure, since everyone lies these days. But they do know things, secret things that normal people would never know. Come over here. I want to show you the wall." Juliet stood gingerly and took a step toward the back wall of the big room. I caught up to her and she grabbed my arm to help support her. I felt a pang in my heart escorting her across the room, like I would help my own mother when her strength was failing. As I got close to the wall, I could see that a section was in shadows from bad lighting. Juliet pointed at the wall, and I saw the light switch. As I reached for it to turn it on, I felt her squeeze my arm slightly, and with a snap, all the lights popped on. "Of course, you used the power, didn't you?" She just smiled back at me, and then turned to stare at the wall. Graffiti covered nearly every square inch of the wall, mostly written in permanent marker, but some painted as well. Hundreds of quotes, Bible passages, and inspirational sayings covered the wall. I went closer and read a few. "If there is no enemy within, the enemy outside can do us no harm." African proverb. "If you are not willing to risk, you cannot grow. And if you cannot grow, you cannot become your best. And if you cannot become your best, then you cannot be happy. And if you cannot be happy, well, what else is there? Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." Matthew 18:3. And the last one I read, "The mass of men live lives of quiet desperation." Thoreau. What is the significance of all these sayings?
These are teachings that were passed down either from other leaders we trust or from angels directly.
So how do you know that a person you are speaking to is actually a good angel?
Good question. Unfortunately, the answer is less than you are hoping for. Most of the time, we are not even aware they are around us, no doubt. Occasionally, we are able to identify them, or they give themselves away to help us out, protect us. Don't worry. You'll see a few guardians now that you know to look for them.
Guardians?
Oh, yes. There are different kinds of angels, just like there are different kinds of fallen. Guardians are the soldiers on the ground, and the leaders or teachers are called the elders.
That was a favorite subject of Sister Wilma from my 4th grade class. Angels all around us, protecting us from the forces of Satan. Weird that she may have actually been not too far off. My gaze drifted across the wall, and I saw many familiar quotes, and I could see how they could fit into their philosophy and the use of the power of creation. One quote was set apart from the others, almost as if it demanded a bigger space, held more importance. I read it aloud. Upon the setting sun of a new day, take heed where demons hide. What's that supposed to mean? I asked Juliet. She paused for several seconds before answering.
We really aren't too sure, to tell the truth. We have been told that it is perhaps the most important lesson we have.
Nella and Mac had joined us at the wall, but remained silent. I looked at all 3 of them, who were contemplating the words for the umpteenth time, no doubt. Any guesses? Surely you must have some idea what it's all about. Nella shrugged and replied,
I admit it's quite strange that no one seems to know anything about it. When we have consulted some of the trusted elders, they won't say anything about it, just that it's extremely important. Nothing else.
Theories are in no short supply, Mac added. Demons are very clever about how they present themselves to you. You have justifiable fears when it comes to your safety and being restarted, but you also need to be aware of their clever chicanery. By the time you figure out that you are being played, you are 10 minutes too late. Don't panic too much about it, though. We are going to help you as much as you let us. I must have had a look of fright on my face. Not surprising, really, since I already identified that I was being played by Tiffany, whom Gladys seemed convinced was part of the fallen army. Mac kept explaining. You see, Finn, demons from the fallen will disguise themselves in various ways just to get close to us, whether it's the mailman or the kindergarten teacher at your school. You can never be too sure who can be trusted. Think about all the people you encounter every day that could be keeping tabs on you, searching for more people like you that have discovered the power. One theory is that the quote on the wall refers to all the places that demons can hide in plain sight, blending in with society, earning your trust. Playing piano in a coffee bar exposes me to numerous people every day. It would be impossible for me to analyze every person to vet out who was a seeker for the fallen army and who was not. These seekers that I'm supposed to avoid, are they possessed? You know, exorcist style, head-spinning, vomit rocket kind of possession? That would certainly be easier to spot anyway. No, you misunderstand. While possessions can happen, they are very rare with humans anyway. Remember that people have free will, so they cannot be controlled. However, the very weak-minded can give up their free will to a demon who can take over their body. And of course, you need to be on the watch for animals who do not have free will. Certain animals seem to be favorites for possession. Cats specifically. Why does that not surprise me? I said. I had dated a girl once who had cats. Cue the involuntary shiver. We didn't get on too well, you could say. In fact, I have a few permanent scars on my arm because I tried to hold my girlfriend's hand. The hand that had previously been petting the furry demon. Yep, that makes sense to me, I replied. What about dogs, though? Daniel suddenly appeared with a look of authority on his face. To my surprise, everyone gave him the floor willingly. He pointed his stub at me. Dogs can be possessed, too. Don't kid yourself. It just doesn't happen that often. I think it has something to do with the temperament and attitude of the specific dog. Most dogs are fairly well-natured, so when you put a command or suggestion in their mind, they want to help you and do things for you. Cats, well, not so much. Oh, they'll do it, but they are really unpredictable. When a demon goes to possess them, the personality of the cat or the dog stays with it. He tapped his stump with his good hand. I lost my hand to a
German Shepherd that wouldn't take my command because it was possessed. I've gotten better at detecting if an animal is already possessed before I try to control it. I won't make that mistake again."
The kid talked pretty freely about the most traumatic thing he'd ever experienced, making the room feel on edge. I felt the need to reply to his vulnerable story. "So, Daniel, why did the demon dog attack you? Did you provoke it?"
"No, Finn, the dog didn't attack me. It was being controlled by the demon, so the dog wasn't at fault."
He hung his head and looked at his shoes.
"It was my fault, really. I knew something was wrong."
His face then perked up and a smile spread across his face.
"But that's when I met Shadrach. He came to my rescue and kept the demon dog from killing me."
"Kind of an odd coincidence, don't you think?" He shrugged.
"Maybe, but when I sent out a panic call for help, he was the only one to come. He's never left my side since, kind of like my bodyguard."
I glanced around and the room seemed on edge. Nella even looked a bit irritated that Daniel had shared his story. Apparently, I still had some work to do to earn their confidence, except for Daniel, who was somewhat an open book. I made another connection with all the reactions to Daniel's story. "Is there a reason why everyone is so protective of this kid?" I asked. "Is it too much to ask where his parents are?" A collective gasp filled the room, and Nella got to her feet, already cutting off anyone who thought about offering a reply.
"I think it's time for lunch."